Hello, everyone. Welcome to this MBF Plus event, our first event in November. This event, like our other MBF Plus events, is in partnership with Fact and Fiction Books. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival, and I'm really excited to welcome Carl Smith and Jeremy N. Smith to this event tonight. A few side notes before we begin. To you, our audience, please feel free to submit any questions you have for Carl or Jeremy via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen there. Here on the back end of things, we'll be reading your questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. We'll see them and we can relay them, but easiest to just put them in the Q&A. Do, however, feel free to use the chat function for a conversation amongst yourselves, to comment about what's being said, or throw out, again, any questions. We'll address those questions probably the last 10 minutes or so. I think Jeremy will probably moderate those. The way tonight's events are gonna go, I'm gonna introduce Jeremy, who will then introduce his dad, Carl, and then the conversation will swing off from there. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jeremy. Jeremy N. Smith is a writer, freelance journalist, and podcaster based in Missoula, Montana. Hi, Jeremy. His work has appeared in Gourmet, Savor, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Chicago Tribune, among many other publications. He is the author of Growing a Garden City, Epic Measures, and Breaking an Entry. Welcome, Jeremy, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I will welcome Carl to the screen if he's up for it. Carl Smith is the Franklyn, Bliss, Snyder Professor of English and American Studies and Professor of History Emeritus at Northwestern University, and he's my dad. He's written at least 4 previous books, some of which you could probably see behind him, that include the word Chicago somewhere in the title. But remarkably, Chicago's Great Fire is both his and the world's first book history by a historian, one of the most famous disasters in U.S. history, whose 150th anniversary is right around the corner. So it's an awesome book, eerily relevant to today, with rave reviews all over the place, including Booklist, Library Journal, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chicago Tribune, which calls it a revelatory pleasure to read, which I strongly second. If you haven't already, please buy your copy at our official event bookseller, factandfictionbooks.com. I'm sure there'll be a link in the chat. And while you're multitasking, please donate at montanabookfestival.com and help keep amazing free events like this coming. Our plan for the evening is Carl and I will discuss the book for about a half hour. Then we'll take your questions. Please submit those through the Q&A if you can. And meanwhile, you can eye the chat for additional pointers and questions for you, and we'll try to eye the chat too. I find it distracting to see myself when I do this, so I'm going to now hide myself from me, but hopefully not you. And Dad, you can let me know if I disappear or freeze up or any of those other Zoom-like things happen. Am I still here to your presence, Dad?
You very much so.
All right. Welcome. The Chicago fire took place October 8th through 10th, 1871. How big was Chicago at that point, and how fast had it grown?
Well, Chicago is a 19th century phenomenon. 40 years before the fire, it barely existed, maybe 100 settlers there. I mean, Native Americans had lived in the area for a long time, and one of the first projects with the settling of Chicago, very unfortunately, but very typically, was removing them. But by 1850, there were 30,000 people. By 1870, 300,000 people. This is clearly just absolute remarkable phenomenon. 330,000 estimated at the time of the fire, basically created out of the things that we identify with the 19th century. Westward expansion, immigration, industrialization, the steam power, the railroad and telegraph revolutions.
So it's funny, some Montanans, when I tell them I'm from the Chicago area, they say I've never been out east. And, growing up, of course, I thought of myself as being from the Midwest. But then in, 1871, this was the Northwest,
This
or close
definitely
to it.
was the Northwest. Chicago was created where it was because of its location at the western tip of the Great Lakes and what was the old Northwest Territory. California and Montana and other places certainly existed, but this was the West, the hinterland.
And, hence you, for example, taught at Northwestern University. That's why it's called the Northwest. And the Northwestern University president at this time, there's a great quote in the book, said, "So long as that section of the country called the Northwest has life, here must be its heart." So what was Chicago's political, economic, and geographic role in the U.S. at this point?
Well, it was basically, in many ways, it's Chicago's settlers get a lot of credit for founding this city out of the mud in this on the edge of the prairie and where it meets the Great Lakes. But Chicago is really a creation, as I said, of the 19th century. It is outside money. Investors in the East Coast, in New York and in Europe, that create this place because the value and importance of having this nexus right here between, again, the western edge of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, a place that, especially once the Illinois-Michigan Canal was built connecting Chicago to the Mississippi, became this major nexus through which the raw materials of the west, of the Northwest, and including places like Montana, could go east, and manufactured goods could go west, and people going in all kinds of directions and all this. So it's this kind of critical node in a national and international economy, all the more so only 2 years before the fire, it's the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. By 1871, you could travel to San Francisco in 100 hours.
And politically, at least, right? For example, in the book, you talk about Lincoln's family, or some of them, still not only still being there, but being in Chicago at the time of the fire, right?
Sure. Well, Lincoln, is from Kentucky and came to Illinois, I think, in 1831, born 1809. So as a young man came to, and then moved to Springfield, although he was in Chicago a good deal and did a lot of legal work that was related to the development of Chicago. But in 1871, he was, of course, sadly assassinated 6 years earlier, and his wife, his widow, Mary, and his son, the only, at this point, surviving of the boys, the oldest one, Robert Todd Lincoln, were living on the south side of Chicago, and Robert Todd Lincoln was beginning a career as basically a corporate lawyer in Chicago. He's in his late 20s at this time.
So how, I guess just for a minute, the economic role. So the way I think of it, at least, is there are hungry shoppers for meats and grains and the like on the East, and in Europe probably as well. And there's raw ingredients for that in the even further West, and Chicago is the processing core. Is that already the case? Or
Oh, absolutely. Well, Chicago, even before this, by the 1850s, is sort of the late 1840s and the 1850s, it becomes a central market for major commodities, lumber, grain, coal, other things like this, and the railroad center of the country. It is already, though, by the time of the fire, partly because of the impetus of the demand of the Civil War, becoming also a major manufacturing center as well, and processing center. But all these different commodities, I forgot to mention, as you said, meat. The Union Stockyards, the legendary Union Stockyards, were open Christmas Day, 1865. They're only 6 years old at the time of the fire.
So we've got a huge manufacturing hub. We've got Lincoln's family. We've got 330,000 other people.
A huge mercantile hub, transportation hub, communications hub.
And there's a fire. how
A big
big was
fire.
the fire? How much of the city did it destroy? And how many people did it displace?
The fire was a big one. It was one of the great urban fires in history, like with the Moscow fire, the London fire of 1666, the San Francisco fire of 1906. It burned about a third of the city, and the city was a good deal smaller then. But it's also crucial what part of it burned. The entire commercial downtown, virtually every major business, every major hotel, all the theaters, the banks, that kind of thing. And then virtually the entire north side of the city, 13,300 of 13,800 buildings, a third of the city's valuation gone in 30 hours. About 90,000 of those 330,000 people instantly without a place to live. And I'm almost virtually positive that many more without a place to work. So no source of income, as well as no place to stay. And winter is coming.
The death toll is remarkably low.
Yes.
And in a crazy coincidence, there's a much more fatal fire, basically the same time, not that far away. Can you explain how the death toll was so low and what that other fire was and the toll there?
The other fire is one that's probably much more familiar to Montanans. I just have to back up a tiny bit and say the whole summer of 1871 is absolutely virtually without any rain, almost none, and there are fires all over the place. The thing about this fire is because of a combination of circumstances, it catches hold and burns as much as it does. But the very same night as the Great Chicago Fire, October 8th, 1871, a town called Peshtigo, Wisconsin, and the surrounding area near Green Bay, about 200 plus miles north of Chicago, which is basically a pine farm. Places like Chicago are basically taking the pine in Michigan and Wisconsin and moving it into Chicago. And it just catches fire and woof, it goes up. And to this day, it is the greatest single loss of single loss of life by any fire. 1,500 people estimated that same night. Chicago, it's a little hard to tell for sure because of bodies disappearing and a lot of single people aren't traced, but the guesses are around 300 people. Probably because unlike the people in Peshtigo, they could see it coming. It started as a small fire and started to move from the west side of the city across to the center of the city and then north, and they could run. They could see it coming and they could try to escape. Still, several hundred people, you can't dismiss that.
You do such an amazing job of putting us on the scene, following real life individual characters. So I guess first, just as a background, what's the ethnic and class makeup of Chicago at the time of the fire? Who's there in sort of broad demographic terms?
Sure. Well, one of the kind of popular things about the fire is that it burned and then people all rallied and they rebuilt the city. And as I argue in this book, in many ways, the fire revealed and deepened divisions that were already there. Chicago, first of all, getting back to the fact that there was virtually nobody there, no settlers there in 1830, and then 330,000 people, 1871. It's a city that's just impromptu. It has no past. It's full of people who were born somewhere else, whether abroad or in other parts of the United States. First of all, virtually half of Chicagoans were born in another country altogether. About 1 in every 5 born in Germany, better than 1 in every 8 born in Ireland. The city's economic and social elite were native-born American Protestants for the most part, but they are very heavily from New York State and New England. And all these people, and as I said, many of them have grown to adulthood before they have arrived even. And this is a kind of a sudden city, an impromptu place. And guess what? They didn't all see things the same way. And they didn't experience the fire the same way either. As we see with COVID, one of the recurring things with disaster is it strikes the already disadvantaged harder than it does the wealthier and the more privileged.
And is it, what's the African American population at that point?
Very small at this point. It's a vital population that lives just south of downtown, but it's just a little over 1%.
And so it's about 50% foreign-born from another country
altogether,
and about 49% of the rest are not from Chicago.
Well, I would say probably under 10% are from Chicago.
Right. Well, I meant 99% of the people who are living in Chicago aren't born in Chicago.
Well, I don't think it's quite 99%, but as I said, they're from other places altogether. And when you talk about ethnicity, if you count the population that has either by being born abroad or born in this country has at least one foreign-born parent, that's probably 80% or very close to it of the population.
I was amazed at just how similar the anti-immigrant descriptions, or I should just say the immigrant descriptions, the descriptions specifically of the Irish, the Italian, and the German were just exactly identical to descriptions of people from Mexico and south of Mexico coming to the United States today. And the drawings in the cartoons, meanwhile, were like caricatures I'm more familiar from, of Black people. So can you, explain where we are in the path to Irish, Italian, German, being quote unquote?
Well, there are not many Italians in Chicago at this point.
Okay, so Irish and German, I'll say.
Mostly Irish and German, then Scandinavian, then British and so on. A lot of Bohemians, or now called around where the Czech Republic is, that area. And let me say, but in relation to what Jeremy is saying, there's about 7 in these illustrations. The book has about 70 illustrations from the time and 7 maps that try to, especially if you're not from Chicago, help you locate where things are very much. It is absolutely remarkable, the ethnic prejudice and slurs. In some ways, you could say it's quote unquote worse than it is now, because we're talking about the major papers like the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Times. It is just a given that Irish are drunks and filthy, and it is just a given that of the superiority of the British people of British ancestry, Protestant religion. And these things work out in all kinds of ways. I mean, there are fights before the fire and then right after the fire about temperance, about enforcing laws about drinking. And what these are really about is not so much drunkenness, but about a war on Irish and German culture. And meanwhile, these are the people who overwhelmingly make up workers in Chicago. And these are the people who built Chicago just as much as any entrepreneur. They are the people who dug the canal, who put up the buildings, and then after the fire were there to rebuild it. So it's tricky. And what makes it a little bit more complicated is that by 1871, they're 60% of the electorate. So they are electing representatives on the Common Council, the unicameral body, which is the most powerful political body in Chicago. And anybody they elect is automatically corrupt. and venal, while the people we elect are, of course, honest.
And you describe this as being, not just the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Times. I just would add that it's also the descriptions you get in the national newspapers and the New York newspapers.
Oh, absolutely. There's this idea that's in many of these papers and leading journals like The Nation, which is relatively young then, still exists today, of this idea of the best men. And these are, of course, native-born Protestant and of supposedly of culture and superior breeding, and of superior judgment. And they should be the ones to whom power should be entrusted. And the great threat are these immigrants and corrupt. And what's in the background here are other events, such as in the exact time of the Chicago fire, Boss Tweed is indicted for corruption in New York. And that's a kind of model in people's minds of corrupt urban politics that Chicagoans are trying to emulate.
So I'm sure you'll get more of this kind of question in the Q&A, but as I said, you weave in stories from all the kind of classes, characters, ages, men, women, visitors to the city, people who had lived there right before the fire. How did you pick whose stories to weave together and whose point of view to follow? Because you're just on the scene when you're writing it. And I just have to imagine it was so tricky to figure out who are we going to follow for this particular moment.
Well, Henry James said, fiction is selection. I think writing history is selection too, to a certain degree. You try to make it as, what can I say, representative as possible. And one of the very important developments of the last several decades that we see intensively discussed all the time is this inclusivity, that when these histories are told, who's left out. And traditional Chicago history, until a few decades ago, is about these makers and shakers, the Marshall Fields and the George Pullmans, who came here and built this city in the mud. And they are overrepresented in the sources we have, because these were the people who had access, had time, had education, had access to writing materials, were literate more, and masters of the language, and access to publication. But there are, though, a lot of other things out there. And what I tried to do, as best I could, was get these other voices in there. So they are underrepresented in the sources that we have, but I tried to make them more equally represented in that it's their story too. So it's not just the demonizing of Mrs. O'Leary, supposedly for something, but put her in her life and what church she belonged to and what her family life was like. There are very few women in previous things and of any class, and I try to get them a lot of children in here, more working people. A historian, I tried to dig to see what I could find, and I'm sure there are things I missed, but I also looked in foreign language newspapers, a voice that in most histories up to now just neglect entirely. The biggest foreign language newspaper in the United States was published in Chicago, the Illinois Staatszeitung, 15,000 daily copies. And the German community is so large, that it's got entrepreneurs in it, it's got educated people, it's got skilled workers, and it's got all kinds of people in it. And so you can't talk about the Germans. In fact, Germany has just only then started to exist as a actual country.
I was moved at the intimacy of people saving or losing their most precious possessions. What's one example that stands out for you?
Well, I'm trying to think of one example. What I was very moved by is, particularly when I was first trying to work on this, the story of a girl and her doll. But it's more that I tell a number of things of what people took. I mean, and again, I try to tell this as a human story. What's it like to experience this thing when you know this is the end? A whole way of life is going to be gone, or very likely going to be gone, and you have you. What can you take? What do you take? Do you take the stories of of pets, of dolls, of which clothes, of people taking paintings of the religious paintings,
Or so many people burying their valuables.
Well, that's a whole other thing. I can't believe it, to be honest with you, but there's just too many stories not to believe it, of people in the midst of this getting a shovel and burying stuff in the hope that it would protect it, and burying not just stuff, but multiple stories of burying pianos, stoves. First of all, I don't know what a buried piano sounds like once you unbury it, if it survives, but all these wonderful stories. But people then, just in their craziness, a broken piece of a lamp, a piece of tubing or something.
But money, your property records, I mean, these are
Property
all go up in
records,
flames
money,
when
if you
downtown
can't-
goes down.
Yeah. When the city first starts to burn, as a precaution, a lot of businessmen who live further out from the town go to their offices on this Sunday night, October 8th, and try to take out things. Robert Todd Lincoln, who's a lawyer, goes to his office, puts a tablecloth on a table, dumps a lot of stuff in, and basically takes it as a knapsack and makes his way out of there. And others, things both precious and in some ways useless, some just sentimental. But just think of what you would do, and I'm sure people in Montana think of this a good deal, that you get the word, get out, and that your house may not be there, tomorrow. What do you take?
Donations.
And this is in Montana, at least there's some sense that could happen.
Donations pour in from across the country and around the world, yet an elite private group takes over the relief efforts. You've talked about this a little, but they're quite strict about who can be helped and how. So what happened, and how do you connect it to our ideas about the deserving or undeserving poor, or the social safety net today?
Well, these are ideas that are very much coming into play then and very much exist now. I'll work backwards. We hear resistance to giving people more aid, and the rationale for that is it will discourage them from going to work, and we need them to go to work. Now, whether there's work to go to is a whole other question right now. But as you just said, the world, partly because Chicago is right on the transportation nexus and right on the telegraph nexus, the rest of the world hears about it, the city burning, as it's still burning. It's, I argue, is the first sort of viral instant news event. So supplies and money are coming to Chicago while it is still burning. And this accumulates to about, in today's dollars, $250 million. About well over $200 million. And it's given to the people of Chicago, but under various pressure from this elite, a small organization of these kind of Yankee leadership says, give us the money to disperse. It's an extraordinary, I call it a coup. So they have the resource, because there's no other safety net in 1871. There's no federal disaster areas or things like that. And they set up a system that is deeply suspicious of the working poor, that you have to prove you need the money. You can't take the money unless you also take it, or supplies, unless you accept a job that we find for you. If you turn it down, nothing for you. And meanwhile,
2 letters of reference, right?
Multiple letters of reference from someone that we trust, and then a visit in the home to make sure that you're not faking.
But this is potentially 90,000 people we're talking about.
Well, we're talking in the tens of thousands for this, certainly. But probably at least half that number, yes.
Getting into a Chicago winter, of course.
And going into a Chicago winter. And this group, and these are very capable people. And in many ways, they manage things very well. And they see themselves as riding to the rescue of Chicago, because if we gave it to these elected officials, they just all pocket it all and they'd be incompetent. But meanwhile, they are basically trying to rebuild the Chicago according to the way they want it to be, keeping a kind of economic hierarchy, making sure that their interests are carefully looked out for, and being very suspicious of working people, especially foreign people, and meanwhile also a lot of not providing translators when a lot of Chicagoans can't speak any language but German, and treating people with suspicion, while at the same time assuming that people like them would be too proud to ask for aid, and sort of seeking them out and giving them help to make sure that they aren't embarrassed by this whole situation. What's behind this is also an assumption that these people are not as sensitive as we are. And that, I think we see a lot of that now, that it's good enough for them, what we're giving them, maybe better than they would do themselves. But there's this great suspicion of, what can I say, the working poor in this country.
This also, of course, happens just a month, it's mid-October, mayor and city council elections. So what political factions form? What political factions form, and what are some of the accusations they trade that may be familiar to us today?
Well, as nasty as our elections seem to us, and as biased as our news sources seem to us or are accused of being, they're like minor league compared to elections in this period, and newspapers are unabashedly expressions of interests. And so anyway, so the city is just burned down, and this is in a period, remember I say there is this tension between this kind of Yankee elite and a city common council that's got that represents ethnic interests more. And this elite gets behind Joseph Medill, an owner of the Chicago Tribune, on a reform ticket, a fireproof ticket, saying, trust us, we will build it. And rather than go in the traditional, at this point, it's different than it is now, but still basically Republicans and Democrats will pick the best men from all parties who are above reproach and elect them. And the other parties are the crooks and the corrupt people. And it gets into a deeply dirty election. But the Medill and his backers basically win the election. This will shift back and forth because of the reaction to their prejudices in the 1873 election. An unprecedented amalgamation of workers and Germans and Irish elect their mayor and their city council. And so Chicago is, the fire takes, that's why I say it reveals things are already there. It takes place and emphasizes this already pitched battle between different kinds of interests in the city.
There's an incredible positivity amidst the disaster. You quote so many city boosters saying, even while it's burning, we'll be bigger and better than ever in no time. And in many ways, they're right. So what's the psychology at work, and just stats? How quickly did Chicago build back to pre-fire levels and beyond? Is that growth that you mentioned going from nothing to 300-some thousand in 40 years, was that interrupted or flatlined or accelerated? Yeah. What happened?
Well, every disaster has, what can I say, or any major event has certain timely and certain timeless qualities. Almost any disaster, there is a period of despair, and then there is often this period of kind of rallying and we can do it. But Chicagoans, the point is that they say behind the rhetoric, they had truth. Time was on Chicago's side. The same forces that existed that built Chicago in the first place were still absolutely there. Much of the commodities were not burned. The railroad was still in place. The telegraph was still in place. And of course, most important, the location was still in place. And so all the things that were made Chicago, and if anything, it was the need for a place like that was even more than it had been up to that point. So Chicago was slowed a bit, as was the whole country, by the panic of 1873, a major depression. But Chicago was basically rebuilt by then, with a bigger downtown than before the fire. And by 1890, less than 20 years after the fire, it was 3 times the size it was at the time of the fire. It was a million people. It was the second biggest city in the United States. By 1910, it was around 2 million. Chicago just kept growing, again, for larger reasons, up to 1950. It slowed in the Depression, basically. It was the first time it really slowed. But absolutely growth. When a disaster happens is very, very important. Absolutely. So that Chicago was, if it had to be burned down, it couldn't have been a better time. You could say that a little bit about San Francisco in 1905. You can't say that about New Orleans and Katrina in 2005, which hit the city when it was already down.
We've got some great questions piling up from the audience. I want to give you a little bit of a lightning round for a minute here. Okay. Some things I got. Okay. True or false? Milwaukee becomes our beer capital because the breweries in Chicago burn.
I don't think so. First of all, cities are in competition with one another. And fire or no fire, Minneapolis becomes a milling capital, passes Chicago and other. I don't have the statistics on Chicago beer versus Milwaukee beer. But these cities are competing with each other. Of course, Milwaukee never grows to the same size, but Milwaukee has this very large German population, which is very important to the beer industry. But I don't have the number on total gallons of beer or per capita beer or what a capital might mean in 1871. Certainly there are plenty of breweries in Chicago and a number of them burn.
One more for me.
Sorry if that wasn't true or false.
I liked it. I liked it. One more for me. I'm going to try to do the share screen. I'm going to show you an image and I want you to tell me if this is a right before the fire image of Chicago. Can you see it?
I can see it. No, it isn't.
You're absolutely right.
But let me say this. Buildings like this were all over Chicago, and this is a major reason why it could burn so thoroughly. They're full of rickety, hastily built, slapped together, ready to burn wooden buildings, but think of them as thousands of them. Think of them right next to each other, 2 or 3 sometimes on a lot, and then connecting them, raised wooden sidewalks as if you were laying a fire, and wooden picket fences between them. And where there were streets, wooden streets.
I'm going to close that. I'm going to quickly just show an example of what you're talking about. This is
the O'Leary house where the O'Leary family, they lived in the rear of this kind of double cottage.
So that's that.
And there you see, and it ironically, as we say, didn't burn. The fire began north of it and where the barn was, and that burned. But you saw those raised sidewalks and those picket fences.
Yes, and that original that first photo I showed you, I'll show you what was right across from from those barns, and you could tell there's cows too. This is a photo I took this weekend in New Chicago, Montana.
New Chicago, Montana.
New Chicago, which has considerably fewer than 320,000 people at this point, but it's got the barns, it's got the cows. So we're only 149 years behind in our catch up.
Well, one of the things I show is a photograph of some of the buildings built right after the fire on Michigan Avenue, right in the center where like the Art Institute is now. And it looks like a Western town. They're just these fronts, wooden street, and the only thing, there's some burn trees on the side, and behind it is Lake Michigan. So it's, but it looks just like, to me, it looks like a movie's like Universal Studios Frontier Town or something.
So I'm going to start going through the Q&A. Give people a chance there. Feel free to keep adding to it, and we'll get what we can get. We've got David from Boston. I love a good story. Can you share a tale of heroism from that terrible fire?
Oh, there's lots and lots of tales of heroism, and some that really mattered a great deal. There was a real estate firm called Shortall and Horde, and John G. Shortall had in his files a lot of real estate records, and meanwhile, the City Hall, where all the official real estate records were, and most other records, burned down. They were gone. And so a city burns down, and you have to try to establish who owned what and where. And by a thing called the Burnt Records Act, the records that Shortall and a few other firms salvaged became taken as official. And supposedly, knowing everything else was lost, he had his people in his office take the stuff, and he piled it into a wagon, had trouble getting the wagon, and supposedly, and I'm not sure this is true, to help him do it, he, at the point of a gun, recruited prisoners who were let out of the city prison in the City Hall rather than let them burn to death, and said, "You just help me," and he kept them supposedly at gunpoint. But there's all kinds of other stories about rescues of people who had wagons or whatever and were saving their stuff, and suddenly there was this pregnant woman, and they throw their stuff off and put her on the wagon, and that sort of thing, or escapes through the burning city on a tugboat and that sort of thing. It's full of all these different kinds of stories, and I try to tell some of them.
And they go again, talking about Montana. I mean, they flee to the prairie, which is just right outside of town.
It's not even outside of town.
It's inside of town. Yeah.
Chicago is 1/6 the size then as it is now, but at the edges, nothing. It's open prairie, and they go there. And they even go another place. To those of you who know where Lincoln Park is, at the bottom of it, at this point, it was a city cemetery, and people run there, and so they basically take refuge among the dead.
And of course, Chicago borders a lake, and you've got a few people, on the lakefront describing, but it sounded
several thousand
very
people.
Hot. It sounded just terrifyingly hot.
It terrifyingly hot, so much so that they wade into the lake. They drive their wagons into the lake. They try to put their backs to the city and wet things and put them on their faces and their bodies to try to cool them and that. But this is a fire that it's an inferno. I can't really impress Montanans with this, but it melted glass. It bent iron. The streetcar tracks were curled up. It takes temperatures well over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit to do that. Limestone buildings turn to powder. Wooden buildings burn like a piece of paper. They just sort of, whoop, just sort of curl into themselves.
how much of the damaged property, this is from Greg Squires, how much of the damaged property was covered by insurance?
Approximately half of the property was covered by insurance. And again, this is where the wealthy do better. They were more likely to have insurance, and they were more likely to have insurance with a company that survived. About half of the insurance was never paid because the companies just went under. The more you if you bought it from a New York or a London company, it was more likely to pay you off than but several dozen Illinois fire insurance companies went under, and a number of companies in the rest of the country went under.
I thought it was remarkable. You tell the story about when they are finally rebuilding, they still don't want to make, I mean, there's still so much resistance to making it fireproof. It will just cost too much. It will get in the way. And the only thing that really makes it happen is the insurers come together and say, we, 80% of the insurance market, will not touch Chicago.
We will not insure you if you do not.
This giant city, it's not a little guy, it's like saying we're not going to insure.
Right. And let me say, even then, they went through the motions, and they did a bunch of things, but serious fire prevention, and this is in other cities as well, is not really is a 20th century phenomenon, and not even at the beginning of the 20th century. It's really starting in the second and third and fourth and fifth decades of the century.
Here's a fun one from Christopher Comer. When I moved to Chicago in the 1970s, it was hard not to notice that all the city fire trucks were red with black highlights, often the roof of the cab. I was told this was in memory of the Great Fire. Is this true or a myth?
I have no idea. When we first moved to Evanston, Illinois, I remember I was struck by the fire trucks were yellow, but now they're all red again. I thought red was just a traditional color of nowadays. At the time of the fire, they looked a good deal different, but I cannot answer that question. I am sorry, Professor Comer.
You touched on this a little, but did the fire change? This is an anonymous question. How did the fire change how Chicago politicians campaigned or what they focused on in the long term, as well as right after?
In the long term, you got to define that. All I can say is that Medill was elected in the fall of 1871 on the fireproof ticket. And what he tried to put in place was an outlawing of buildings made with the exteriors as well as the framing of wood. And that was taken as, it's obviously a good idea in terms of preventing fire, but as a class and economic issue, that workers said, it's all well and good for you to say buildings have to be made of brick and stone, but we can't afford that. And Chicago had a fairly high rate of ownership of homes by workers. Say, we have this land, and if we can't build a house we can live in on it, the land is worthless. And that becomes a strong point of tension. So, fire comes and goes as an issue. Where it really becomes a major issue is something I talk about near the end of the book. As late as later, this is now more than 30 years after the fire. 1903 is a major downtown theater fire called the Iroquois Theater Fire, where 600 people, twice as many as who died in the Great Chicago Fire, die in a modern theater because of bad exits and no fireproofing and poor fire escapes. And that's the kind of thing that gets the kind of politics of fire going on. Another complication in terms of politics and fire is both for a long period, including well after the fire departments and the police departments are political animals. And whether you get a job and whether you get promoted can be a political thing, including bribes. So the whole idea of a clean and merit-driven department takes a while.
We got a great question from Matt Buckiss about your process for writing the book and when this journey began. And, I was going to ask that too. I remember this project in my memory began in a totally different form. It began as one of the first multimedia websites, on earth in the 90s. And then as a very early iPhone app. And now it's this book. So maybe you would describe the journey differently, but maybe talk about those precursor projects and
Well, even started before that.
How'd you develop the book?
I'm a cultural and intellectual historian for the most part. I talk about how ideas matter, how people understand life, and particularly in developing cities. So I wrote a book about Chicago in the period that starts with the fire and includes the Haymarket riot and the Pullman strike. But I was really talking about the meaning of these events and how people process them. And the description of the fire in that book is 2 paragraphs long. Here it's 7 chapters. I wrote, and then I did this project in cooperation with Northwestern and with the Chicago History Museum. I was a kind of curator and author to at the 125th anniversary of the fire to basically give us a history of the fire, but it's mostly images and talk about different ways of fire as remembered. And working on it, and in renewing that in 2011 when we made it more up to date technically and built the iPhone app, it just became clearer and clearer to me that there was still no straight narrative history of the burning of Chicago, and then what it was like after, and then the rebuilding of Chicago, and then the kind of heritage of the fire that was done in any kind of depth and completeness, and that was, what can I say, documented. You don't have to read them, but I tried very carefully to make sure that everything in this book was sourced. Where did I get this? Where did I get that? Including from wider sources than before. There's a lot of folklore around the fire, lots of stories, and a lot of things that don't talk about the complications that I talked about conflicts and so on. So to answer Matt's question, I was just trying for almost for the first time in my career to write a narrative history that emphasized less than I did in the other books, the meaning of it all as a kind of cultural event or as how ideas changed, then what was it like to live through this thing? A story of people, a story of events, a story of just what's the visceral feel of this thing, and set against this remarkable thing called American urbanization, in which all these other things I talked about before, expansion, immigration, political change, industrialization, all come together. But mainly, what happens? How did the fire progress? How did people respond to it? Where did they go? What did they do? And then here's what it's like when the city is like this. How did they start to put things together and move on?
Like a 4th grader, did you use your own website as a resource for your book, or did you have to dive back into the archives and figure out? You thought you'd put the comprehensive website together to do the book. You had to,
as in every
find so
other
much more.
book I ever wrote, I wildly underestimated the amount of work this would require. I was astonished at how little I knew in terms of telling the story I wanted to tell. And I just went back to the originals I had a lot of notes, that certainly helped, but I read a tremendous amount of new newspapers, new primary stuff, more speeches, more reports, kinds of things which I didn't need particularly to look at before, and looked at more things that were taking place elsewhere, and phenomena like changes in publishing and distribution of newspapers and businesses and where things were, and hence the maps, trying to where all the, just locate things as a kind of experiential event.
Last question. This is from Debbie Smith. Why did you decide to end the book with Mrs. O'Leary and her cow? And I'll add this. I was going to ask this: am I true or false? You know, are these? Did Mrs. O'Leary and the cow start this fire? Here's Norman Rockwell's ride.
This is a 1935 painting by Norman Rockwell for a calendar. He said it was the worst painting he ever did. Not that it was a bad painting, but who wants to look at the rear end of a cow for 12 months? But I put this in a larger thing. I tell the evolution of the story of Mrs. O'Leary. She did not start the fire, but from being demonized as this clumsy, drunken Irish welfare cheat to this kind of figure of folklore, as you see in there. Urban history is tricky for beginnings and endings. Cities, keep on. And I tried to put some shape on this narrative. I started it with her and I ended it with her. But the justification for ending with her was that basically the first half of the book is about the burning of the city, the second half of the book about the rebuilding of the city. And then the final chapter is a kind of retrospective reflection on how the fire has been remembered. So I talked about the various ways in which the fire was sort of integrated largely into an idea of Chicago. The great lesson of Chicago being destroyed was that it couldn't be destroyed, the way it rebuilt. But then also the different legends that come out of it, and I thought it just seemed to work well to come back to Mrs. O'Leary, because it took a thing that started in this little barn and then opened up, and then at the end basically came back to this real life.
I'll give the closing question to Jerry Goldman. Have you given any thought to a virtual reality version of the book? This would let people experience the fire, by putting on their headset and letting the flames while away.
There are attempts. I think if you've seen the public television telling of Donald Miller's City of the Century, it has a section where the fire. There's a recent WTTW documentary where you see flames everywhere.
In the book, you talk about this technology, and I got to just say it. I'll cut you off because we got to close in a second. But it's called a cyclorama, right?
Yes.
Which is what's the dimensions? It's that you're in a room and with these amazing
400. I'm sorry, no, 550 by 80 murals where it's like one at Gettysburg. We see the Battle of Gettysburg. You stand in the middle and you look at these paintings surrounding you that make you feel like you're in the middle. So there is VR, and there's also thousands of stereographs of the post-fire city. But I will need several zillion dollars and technical qualities I do not have to do that, and I'm not sure the result would be any better. Another idea I once had when I wrote about the Chicago stockyards was to have scratch and sniff pictures, but I didn't do that either.
On that note, thank you so much. Again, everyone, go to factandfictionbooks.com and grab the book if you haven't already. Please consider going to montanabookfestival.com, and you will be greeted by a donate button, but also all our amazing upcoming events ahead. Thank you, Dad, so much for so many things, but in this moment for the pleasure of your company and the pleasure of your book, which is so wonderful in the last hour.
Right back at you. And thanks so much to the Montana Book Festival and independent bookstores.
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Carl, and congratulations on the release of your book. So exciting. Thank you, everyone watching. I'm going to just repeat what Jeremy said. Go to factandfictionbooks.com to purchase the book. We had some donations during this event, so thank you so much to those of you who went to montanabookfestival.com to donate. And just to let you know, those donations go towards MBF Plus programming like this event and like our next event, which is with Richard Manning and Rick Bass on Thursday, December 3rd. So they'll be chatting about Richard's book. If it sounds good, it is good. So again, thank you for your donations. Thank you for supporting the Montana Book Festival and your authors, independent bookstores. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.